In TechNova's gleaming Silicon Valley headquarters, a brilliant engineer was about to discover just how expendable his company considered him. What started as a routine morning commute took a shocking turn when he came face to face with corporate betrayal that would shake the entire tech industry. Marcus Chen wasn't your typical software developer. For 8 years, he had spent his life revolutionizing machine learning algorithms, known for breakthrough innovations that had become the backbone of a billion-dollar AI empire. When he encountered his supervisor's calculated dismissal during what seemed like a standard performance review, he had no idea he was walking into a trap designed to strip away his professional identity. Chen's response, methodically documenting every patent he'd filed independently, would lead to a legal earthquake that would redefine how Silicon Valley treats its most valuable creators. What began as a devastating demotion would become the catalyst for industry-wide reform. The tech world would never be the same after one immigrant engineer proved that preparation, principle, and patents could topple even the most powerful corporate giants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen's hand trembled slightly as he swiped his keycard. At TechNova's main entrance, the familiar beep that had greeted him every morning for 8 years, replaced by a harsh red flash and denial tone. He stared at the reader, confusion creeping across his features as he tried again. Same result. "Excuse me, sir?" The security guard's voice carried a practiced politeness that immediately set Marcus on edge. "I'll need to escort you to HR." The walk through TechNova's gleaming corridors felt surreal. Marcus had helped design the AI systems that optimized the building's lighting, the algorithms that managed everything from elevator efficiency to climate control. His code lived in these walls, yet somehow he felt like a stranger being led through hostile territory. The HR conference room smelled of industrial coffee and fresh printer paper. Sarah Mitchell sat at the head of the polished table, her laptop open, fingers dancing across keys with the mechanical precision of someone checking items off a list. She didn't look up when Marcus entered. "Please, have a seat." Her tone carried the warmth of a dental appointment reminder. Marcus settled into the chair across from her, noting how the 2 HR representatives flanked the table like bookends. Jennifer Walsh from Legal Affairs gave him a thin smile. Tom Morrison from Human Resources kept his eyes on his tablet, stylus moving in careful strokes. "Marcus," Sarah began, finally meeting his gaze, "I want to thank you for your 8 years of service to TechNova. Your contributions have been notable." The pause before notable lasted a fraction too long. Marcus's engineer mind cataloged the hesitation, filed it away for analysis. "However," she continued, "with our recent restructuring and the demands of our upcoming public offering, we've had to make some difficult decisions about resource allocation and team optimization." Corporate speak. Marcus had heard it in countless meetings, had even used it himself when explaining technical concepts to non-technical executives. But hearing it directed at him felt different, like watching a familiar tool being used as a weapon. "I'm afraid we're going to have to make some adjustments to your role and responsibilities." "Adjustments?" Marcus's voice came out steadier than he felt. "Due to performance concerns and the need for fresh perspectives in our senior engineering roles, we'll be transitioning you to a junior developer position, effective immediately." The words hit him like a system crash, sudden, complete, devastating. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, 8 years of breakthrough innovations that had put TechNova on the map, 8 years of treating this company like family, and now performance concerns? Marcus kept his voice level, though his hands had begun to clench beneath the table. "I'd like to see the documentation of these concerns." Sarah's smile remained perfectly calibrated. "The evaluation process is comprehensive and confidential. What's important now is moving forward constructively." Jennifer Walsh slid a folder across the table. Your new assignment details are here, along with the updated compensation structure. You'll be reporting to David Park in the Junior Development Pod. David, his protege. The kid he'd mentored from intern to senior developer, taught everything about machine learning optimization, guided through his first major algorithm deployment. The irony wasn't lost on him. This is a temporary adjustment, Tom Morrison spoke, for the first time, his voice carrying rehearsed reassurance. Performance reviews happen quarterly. There's always opportunity for advancement. Marcus opened the folder. His salary had been cut by 40%. His security clearance, downgraded. His access to the research labs, revoked. His office. Where will I be working? Cube Farm, Section C, Sarah replied without checking her notes. It will have your equipment ready by this afternoon. The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like funeral rituals. Marcus walked the hallways in a daze, past his former office, already being cleaned out by facilities staff, toward the elevator that would take him to what felt like exile. David Park stood near the coffee station, his usually animated expression replaced by something Marcus had never seen before: guilt. Their eyes met across the open workspace, and David's gaze immediately dropped to his shoes. "Hey, Marcus," David's voice carried forced cheerfulness. "Heard about the transition. Looking forward to working together again." The word "again" stuck in Marcus's throat. They'd worked together for 3 years, but never like this. Never with David as the superior, Marcus as the subordinate. "Yeah," Marcus managed. "Should be interesting." As David hurried away, Marcus caught fragments of conversation from nearby cubicles. The voices were hushed, but in the open-plan office, whispers carried, "Revolutionary AI optimization technology. IPO launch timeline moved up. Patent filings need to be finalized. Mitchell says we're sitting on a gold mine." Marcus's blood went cold. His AI optimization, algorithms, the ones he'd spent years perfecting, the breakthrough innovations that had solved problems everyone else said were impossible, they were talking about his work. He made his way to Section C, where a nameplate reading M. Chen, junior developer, sat on a desk roughly 1/10 the size of his former office. The computer was already set up, logged into a restricted account that gave him access to basic development tools and nothing more. As he settled into the cramped workspace, Marcus's mind began processing what had just happened with the methodical precision that had made him one of the best engineers in Silicon Valley. This wasn't about performance. This wasn't about restructuring. This was about removing him from any position where he could influence or oversee the use of his own innovations. The IPO. They were going public with his technology, and they needed him out of the way. Marcus opened his laptop and began to work on the simple debugging tasks that had been assigned to him, menial labor for someone of his caliber. But his mind was elsewhere, following logical pathways and analyzing data points. 8 years ago, when he'd first started at TechNova, his father had given him advice that seemed overcautious at the time. "In America, Marcus, we must work twice as hard and be twice as prepared. Trust is good, but documentation is better. Always protect what you build." He'd followed that advice, filed the patents in his own name for the core innovations he'd developed. At the time, it had seemed like simple due diligence. Now, as he sat in his diminished cubicle watching his former colleagues implement plans built on his life's work, those patents suddenly felt like something else entirely. They felt like weapons. Marcus saved his work and locked his screen. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows across the cube farm. He needed to think. He needed to understand exactly what TechNova was planning to do with his algorithms. And he needed to call his father. Marcus's hand trembled as he pushed through the glass doors of Golden Dragon Restaurant. The familiar chime announcing his arrival cutting through the methodical sounds of lunch preparation. The scent of ginger and star anise wrapped around him, like an embrace, a stark contrast to the sterile corporate air he'd just escaped. His father, James Chen, stood at the prep station with his back turned, knife moving in precise, rhythmic strokes through a pile of bok choy. At 68, James still moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades understanding that every motion mattered, every minute counted. He didn't look up when Marcus entered, but his shoulders shifted slightly, the subtle acknowledgement of a man who had learned to read the weight of footsteps, the tenor of breathing. "You're early," James said in Mandarin, not breaking his rhythm. "Lunch rush doesn't start for an hour." Marcus settled onto a stool at the prep counter, watching his father work. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in the way that only exists between people who have shared both struggle and success. James finished with the bok choy and moved to a cutting board lined with prawns, his knife now working with surgical precision to devein each piece. "They demoted me," Marcus said finally, the words falling into the quiet kitchen like stones into still water. James's knife paused for exactly one beat, then resumed its work. After 8 years. It wasn't a question. James Chen had built his life on understanding the patterns of the world, the way institutions treated people like them. He'd watched his son pour his heart into TechNova, had seen the late nights and weekend calls, the way Marcus spoke about his colleagues like family. James had said nothing then, but he'd prepared for this moment anyway. "They said it was performance concerns," Marcus continued, "restructuring, but they're taking my algorithms public. The IPO materials are already referencing my work as company innovations." James set down his knife and finally turned to face his son. His weathered hands reached for the tea kettle, a ritual that had punctuated every serious conversation in Piao. The Chen household for as long as Marcus could remember. "Tell me about the patents," James said quietly. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, surprise, relief, recognition. Of course his father would cut straight to the heart of it. "I filed them like you suggested. All the core innovations, the breakthrough algorithms. I thought you were being overcautious at the time." Overcautious. James poured hot water over tea leaves, the fragrant steam rising between them. "Your mother used to say the same thing when I kept duplicate receipts, when I photographed. Every contract, when I made copies of everything." He paused, his expression growing distant. She learned better. Marcus had heard fragments of this story before, how his parents had lost their first restaurant to a landlord who claimed they'd never signed a lease, how they'd been forced to start over with nothing because they'd trusted handshake agreements and verbal promises. But sitting here now, in his father's second restaurant, built on the foundation of painful lessons, the story felt different. "I was 26 when we lost everything the first time," James continued, settling onto a stool across from his son. "Younger than you are now. We'd been in America for 3 years, thought we understood how things worked. The landlord was so friendly, always asking about our families, our dreams. When he told us not to worry about paperwork, that we were friends, we believed him." James poured tea into 2 small cups, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light, streaming through the restaurant's windows. 6 months later, he tripled our rent, said we'd never had a lease, that we'd been month-to-month tenants the whole time. When we showed him the agreement we'd signed, he laughed, said it wasn't legally binding because it hadn't been notarized properly. He was right. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm cup, breathing in the jasmine-scented steam. "So you started documenting everything." "Everything," James confirmed. "But more than that. I learned the difference between trust and preparation. In China, business relationships are built on guanji, connections, mutual obligation, face. These things matter here too, but they're not enough. In America, paper protects you when relationships fail." He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn leather folder, the kind that had seen decades of use. Inside were receipts, contracts, permits, tax documents, a complete history of Golden Dragon Restaurant, meticulously organized and preserved. When I told you to file those patents, James continued, you thought I was being paranoid, an old immigrant who didn't trust the system. But I wasn't protecting you from the system. I was teaching you to use it. Marcus felt a memory surface. His father's insistence on patent filings, the way he'd quietly paid for the legal fees despite the restaurant's tight margins. At the time, Marcus had been embarrassed by what felt like excessive caution. Now, understanding dawned like sunrise. You knew this could happen. I knew that in America, brilliant immigrants are welcomed for their minds, but not always trusted. With their power, James said carefully. Your algorithms make TechNova valuable. That makes you valuable as long as they need your brain to create. But once the creation is complete, he didn't need to finish. Marcus understood the logic, with painful clarity. As long as he was actively developing the technology, he was indispensable. But once the algorithms were complete, once they were ready for commercialization, he became a liability, someone who could claim credit, demand recognition, or worse, reveal how much of the company's value rested on his individual contributions. They moved me out before the IPO, Marcus said, pieces clicking into place. Made sure I couldn't influence the narrative or the implementation. And assigned you to work under your former student, James added. Humiliation serves a purpose. It makes you want to leave quietly, to avoid the embarrassment of fighting back. Marcus thought of David's guilty expression, the way his former protege had avoided eye contact. The psychological warfare was as calculated as the legal maneuvering. But you prepared me for this, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. The patents aren't just protection, they're power. James smiled, the expression transforming, his weathered features. Your grandfather once told me that in war, the best weapons are the ones your enemy doesn't know you have. TechNova sees a defeated employee, someone they've successfully marginalized. They don't see someone who legally owns the foundation of their entire IPO strategy. What do I do with this power? That, James said, standing to check a pot on the stove, depends on what kind of man you want to be. Revenge feels good, in the moment, but justice lasts generations. Your algorithms could shut down their IPO entirely, cost them hundreds of millions, or you could use this moment to build something better. Force them to acknowledge what they've taken, to change how they treat the people who create their value. Make sure the next brilliant immigrant doesn't have to learn these lessons the way we did. Marcus sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time since that morning's devastating meeting, he felt something other than shock and betrayal. He felt possibility. I'll need a lawyer, Marcus said. Elena Rodriguez, James replied without hesitation. She handled our trademark dispute 2 years ago. Daughter of factory workers, fights for people like us. More importantly, she understands that some battles are worth more than money. Marcus pulled out his phone to make notes, but stopped, when he saw his father watching him with an expression of quiet pride. I'm proud of you, James said simply. Not for the patents, not for being smart enough to protect yourself. I'm proud that my son is the kind of man who needs to think about justice, not just revenge. As Marcus prepared to leave, armed with his father's wisdom and Elena Rodriguez's contact information, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced since that morning. Hope. TechNova had underestimated him, had seen only what they wanted to see, a compliant immigrant engineer who would accept his demotion quietly. They had no idea they were about to discover the power of preparation, the strength that comes from understanding that in America, the most dangerous opponents are often those who've learned to use the system's own rules against it. Marcus hugged his father goodbye, breathing in the familiar sense of the kitchen that had shaped him. Tomorrow, he would begin building his case. Tonight, he would study every patent filing, every legal precedent, every tool his father's wisdom had given him. The game was about to change. Elena Rodriguez's office occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in the Mission District, the kind of space that spoke to practical priorities over corporate aesthetics. Exposed brick walls lined with law books created a backdrop for framed photographs, graduation ceremonies, community celebrations, and courtroom victories that told the story of a lawyer who'd built her practice on principle rather than profit. Margins. Marcus arrived 20 minutes early, a habit inherited from his father's belief that punctuality demonstrated respect. He used the time to study the certificates on Elena's walls: Stanford Law Review, Pro Bono Attorney of the Year, Civil Rights Advocacy Award. Each recognition painted a picture of someone who understood that law was more than procedure. It was power, and power could be wielded for justice. Mr. Chen? Elena emerged from her inner office at exactly their scheduled time, extending a firm handshake. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of focused energy that suggested someone who'd learned to maximize every moment. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her suit was tailored but not expensive, the uniform of someone who needed to be taken seriously in rooms where her presence wasn't automatically respected. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Marcus said as she led him to her office. "Your father spoke highly of you when I handled his trademark case," Elena replied, settling behind a desk covered with organized stacks of legal documents. "He also mentioned you were brilliant but naive about corporate politics. I'm guessing recent events have provided some education." Marcus found himself smiling despite the circumstances. Painful education. The most effective kind. Elena opened a yellow legal pad, pen poised. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Assume I know nothing about your industry. And don't leave out details that feel embarrassing or complicated. Those are often the most important." For the next hour, Marcus walked Elena through 8 years at TechNova. The Dow, late nights developing breakthrough algorithms, the patents his father had insisted he file, the gradual building of trust with colleagues who'd become friends. He explained the technical innovations in layman's terms, the way his machine learning architectures had evolved from academic curiosity to the foundation of TechNova's competitive advantage. Elena took notes constantly, occasionally stopping him to clarify timeline details or ask about documentation. When he reached the previous day's meeting, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Let me make sure I understand the sequence," she said. "They demote you, claiming performance issues, then immediately assign you to report to someone you trained. Meanwhile, they're preparing IPO materials that describe your algorithms as core company innovations without crediting your individual contributions." "That's correct." "And throughout this period, you've maintained detailed records? Email correspondence, technical documentation, evidence of your individual contributions?" Marcus nodded. "My father taught me to document everything. I have 8 years of development logs, email chains showing my collaboration with other teams, even recordings of presentations where I explained my innovations to executives." Elena's expression shifted, the focused attention of a hunter who'd just spotted her prey. "Recordings?" "Company policy encourages documentation of technical presentations. I recorded every major briefing I gave to leadership, partly for my own reference and partly because my father always said." Marcus paused, seeing Elena's slight smile. "He said paper protects you when relationships fail. Your father is a wise man." Elena made several more notes. "Now, let's talk about your patents. You filed them independently, not as work for hire?" "Yes. The core algorithms were developed on my own time, using my personal equipment. I was careful about that after consulting with a patent attorney 3 years ago." "Do you have documentation proving the independent development? Timestamps, personal computer logs, anything that demonstrates when and where you created the initial innovations?" Marcus pulled out a tablet, scrolling through files he'd organized the previous evening. Development logs going back 4 years, showing progression from initial concept to implementation. I worked on the core breakthroughs at home, often after midnight. My personal laptop has creation timestamps, backup files, even electricity bills showing unusual late-night usage patterns. Elena's smile widened. You've been preparing for this without knowing it. My father believed in being prepared for battles you hope never to fight. Smart man. Here's what we're looking at legally. Elena turned to a fresh page on her legal pad. TechNova is making several critical mistakes. First, they're claiming your independently patented work as company innovation in SEC filings. That's not just corporate misconduct, it's securities fraud. They're misleading investors about the true ownership of their core technology. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Securities fraud? When a company files for an IPO, they're required to disclose material risks and dependencies. If their core technology is actually controlled by patents owned by someone they just demoted, that's a massive material risk they're failing to disclose. The SEC takes that very seriously. Elena stood and walked to a whiteboard mounted on the exposed brick wall, picking up a marker. But here's where it gets interesting. Your patents don't just give you defensive power, they give you offensive capabilities. She began sketching a diagram showing TechNova's corporate structure. You can demand licensing fees for any use of your patented algorithms. You can require credit and attribution. Most importantly, you can seek injunctive relief, a court order preventing them from using your technology until they comply with your terms. An injunction would kill their IPO, Marcus realized. Exactly, and they know it, which means you have leverage they can't ignore. Elena capped the marker and returned to her desk. But before we discuss strategy, I need to understand your goals. What do you want from this situation? Marcus had been thinking about this question since leaving his father's restaurant. I want recognition for my work. I want them to acknowledge what they've taken and change how they treat their technical staff. And I want to make sure the next person in my position doesn't face the same betrayal. Justice rather than just revenge. My father's influence. Elena nodded approvingly. Good, because what I'm about to propose requires thinking beyond immediate satisfaction. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching what looked like a battle plan. Here's what we're going to do. First, we file a comprehensive lawsuit alleging patent infringement, securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional interference with business relationships. That gets their attention and forces them to take us seriously. She drew arrows connecting different legal theories. Simultaneously, we file a complaint with the SEC regarding their misleading IPO disclosures. The SEC has been cracking down on tech companies that oversell their intellectual property ownership, and your case is exactly the kind they're looking for. What about the injunction? That's our nuclear option. We prepare the paperwork but don't file immediately. Instead, we use it as leverage to negotiate broader changes. Elena's pen moved rapidly across the page. Here's what we demand. Full attribution for your work in all company materials, reinstatement to an appropriate position with equity compensation, and most importantly, the establishment of an innovation recognition program that ensures future technical contributors receive proper credit and protection. Marcus studied the legal strategy Elena had outlined. It was elegant in its comprehensiveness, using the law not just to seek personal redress, but to create systematic change. What are the risks? He asked. They'll fight back hard. Expect them to claim your work was collaborative, that you're overstating your contributions, that the patents aren't as strong as we believe. They'll try to destroy your reputation in the industry. Elena met his eyes directly. They'll make this personal and ugly. And if we win? If we win, you get justice, and TechNova gets forced to change how they treat their technical talent. More importantly, Other companies will take notice. This could become a landmark case for intellectual property rights in the tech industry. Marcus thought about his father's words the previous day, about the difference between revenge and justice, about building something that would last generations. How long will this take? 18 months to 2 years if they fight it all. The way to trial. But I suspect they'll want to settle much sooner. The SEC investigation alone will complicate their IPO timeline, and their investors won't appreciate the uncertainty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena closed her legal pad and leaned forward. Before you decide, understand what you're signing up for. This will consume your life for the next year. You'll relive every slight, every betrayal, every moment of professional disappointment. Legal battles aren't just about law. They're about endurance. Marcus thought about the previous morning's meeting, the casual cruelty with which 8 years of dedication had been dismissed. Then he thought about his father, starting over at 46 after losing everything, building Golden Dragon through careful preparation and stubborn persistence. My father lost his first restaurant because he trusted without preparing, Marcus said. He taught me to be ready for battles I hoped never to fight. I think it's time to fight. Elena smiled and extended her hand. Then let's build your case, Mr. Chen. And let's make sure TechNova learns that underestimating prepared immigrants is a very expensive mistake. As Marcus shook Elena's hand, he felt the same surge of possibility he'd experienced in his father's kitchen. The game was indeed changing, and this time, he held the winning cards. The law moved with deliberate precision, each filing a carefully orchestrated note in a symphony that would crescendo over the coming months. Elena Rodriguez had warned Marcus that legal warfare was as much about psychology as procedure, and he was beginning to understand what she meant as he watched TechNova's initial response unfold. 3 weeks after filing their comprehensive lawsuit, Marcus sat in Elena's conference room studying the stack of documents that represented TechNova's counterattack. The company had retained Pemberton and Associates, one of Silicon Valley's most expensive legal firms, the kind that specialized in protecting corporate interests against individual challengers who dared to upset established hierarchies. They're throwing everything at the wall, Elena said, spreading TechNova's motion to dismiss across the conference table. Claiming your patents are invalid, that your work was collaborative and therefore owned by the company, that you're a disgruntled employee seeking to damage their business prospects. Marcus read through the legal documents, recognizing the corporate doublespeak that transformed 8 years of innovation into routine technical development, performed within the scope of employment. His breakthrough algorithms became incremental improvements to existing methodologies developed through normal collaborative processes. They're rewriting history, he said. Of course they are. That's what expensive lawyers do. They create alternative narratives that serve their clients' interests. Elena pulled up a document on her laptop. But here's what's interesting. Look at what they're not disputing. She highlighted several passages in TechNova's response. Despite all their legal maneuvering, they hadn't directly challenged his patent's validity or his ownership of the core innovations. Instead, they focused on procedural arguments and character assassination. They're afraid of the technical merits, Marcus realized. Exactly. If they truly believed your patents were invalid, they'd attack them directly. Instead, they're trying to settle this before it reaches discovery, where they'd have to produce internal documents showing exactly how central your work is to their IPO strategy. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. Speaking of which, I just heard from my contact at the SEC. They've opened a formal investigation into TechNova's IPO disclosures. Marcus felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. The Securities and Exchange Commission's involvement elevated this from a private dispute to a matter of public interest. but it also meant the stakes were now much higher for everyone involved. What does that mean practically? It means TechNova can't proceed with their IPO until the SEC completes its investigation. That's hundreds of millions of dollars in delayed funding, plus the growing concern from investors who don't like regulatory uncertainty. Elena closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. More importantly, it means we've got their attention. As if summoned by her words, Elena's assistant knocked on the conference room door. Ms. Rodriguez? There's a Mr. Harrison from Pemberton and Associates on line 1. He says it's urgent regarding the Chen matter. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances. Put him through, Elena said, switching her phone to speaker mode. Ms. Rodriguez, this is David Harrison from Pemberton and Associates. The voice that filled the room carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents through sheer confidence. I represent TechNova Corporation in the matter of Chen versus TechNova. I believe we should discuss settlement possibilities before this situation becomes more complicated for all parties involved. Mr. Harrison, Elena replied, her tone perfectly professional. I'm happy to discuss settlement, though I should note that my client's position remains unchanged. We're seeking full recognition of his contributions, appropriate compensation, and systemic changes to ensure other innovators receive proper treatment. Ms. Rodriguez, I think you may be overestimating your client's position. TechNova is prepared to offer a generous severance package in exchange for a comprehensive release of all claims. We're talking about a 7-figure settlement that would allow Mr. Chen to move forward with his career without the distraction of protracted litigation. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Even in settlement negotiations, they were trying to frame him as the problem, as someone who needed to be bought off and silenced. Elena must have sensed his reaction because she placed a calming hand on his arm before responding. That's interesting, Mr. Harrison. Tell me, does this generous offer include acknowledgement of Mr. Chen's intellectual property rights? Because our understanding is that TechNova's core algorithms are built on his patented innovations. A pause on the other end of the line, long, enough for Marcus to hear the clicking of computer keys. Ms. Rodriguez, TechNova's position is that all work performed by employees belongs to the company. Mr. Chen was well compensated for his contributions during his employment. I see. And what about the patents Mr. Chen filed independently, using his own equipment and time? The ones that predate his employment with TechNova? Another pause, this one longer. We'd need to examine the specifics of those claims. Elena smiled at Marcus, the expression of a chess player who'd just forced her opponent into an unfavorable position. Of course. I'm sure your technical team will find those patent filings very interesting reading, particularly the timestamps and development logs that demonstrate when and how the core innovations were created. Ms. Rodriguez, Harrison's voice had lost some of its initial confidence. Perhaps we should schedule a more comprehensive settlement discussion. My client is prepared to be quite reasonable. I'm sure they are, Mr. Harrison. However, my client isn't interested in being reasonable. He's interested in being right. When TechNova is ready to discuss meaningful recognition and systemic change, we'll be happy to listen. Until then, we'll see you in court. Elena ended the call and turned to Marcus, who was staring at the phone with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. They're scared, she said simply. How can you tell? Harrison is one of the most arrogant lawyers in Silicon Valley. The fact that he called within 3 weeks, offering 7 figures, means their internal analysis shows we have a strong case. They want this to go away before discovery reveals how dependent they are on your innovations. Marcus walked to the window, overlooking the Mission District, watching the afternoon fog roll in from the Pacific. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a demoted employee contemplating whether to quietly accept defeat. Now, he was at the center of a legal battle that could reshape how tech companies treated their most valuable contributors. What happens next? Now, we prepare for the long game, Elena said, joining him at the window. They'll file more motions, try to delay and increase our costs, hoping we'll eventually accept a settlement. Meanwhile, the SEC investigation proceeds, and their IPO remains on hold. She pulled out a timeline she'd been developing, showing the various legal proceedings mapped against TechNova's business calendar. Here's what they're really worried about. Their IPO was scheduled for the fourth quarter, with investor roadshows beginning next month. Every week of delay costs them momentum and increases market uncertainty. Marcus studied the timeline, beginning to understand the broader implications. This isn't just about my case anymore. Exactly. You've become a symbol of something larger. The question of who really creates value in tech companies and how they should be treated. Other engineers are watching this case, wondering if they might have similar claims. Elena's phone rang. Again, this time showing her assistant's extension. Yes? Ms. Rodriguez, there's a reporter from TechCrunch on line 2. She's asking about the Chen versus TechNova case. Wants to know if you have any comment on the SEC investigation. Elena looked to Marcus, raising an eyebrow in question. They'd discussed media strategy, but hadn't expected press attention this quickly. What do you think? She asked. Ready for this to become public? Marcus thought about his father's advice regarding the difference between revenge and justice. Justice, by its nature, had to be visible, had to create precedent that others could follow. Put her through, he said. 20 minutes later, after a careful interview where Elena did most of the talking while Marcus provided technical context, they'd laid out their case for the public record. The story would run the next morning. Patent dispute threatens major. Tech IPO as SEC investigates intellectual property claims? Now it gets interesting, Elena said as they gathered their documents. Once this story breaks, you'll hear from other engineers with similar experiences. TechNova will escalate their legal response, and everyone in Silicon Valley will be watching to see whether individual innovators can challenge corporate appropriation of their work. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility, but also its potential. His father had taught him that the best battles were fought not just for personal vindication, but to create better conditions for those who came after. As he left Elena's office that evening, Marcus checked his phone and found a text from his father. Saw the news. Proud of you. Come by for dinner tomorrow. Your mother's making your favorite dumplings. Some battles, Marcus realized, were best fought with family support and the wisdom of those who'd faced similar challenges. Tomorrow, he would continue building his case, armed with legal strategy and parental love in equal measure. The game was accelerating, and Marcus Chen was ready to play it to the very end. The TechCrunch article published at 6 a.m. Pacific time, and by 8 a.m., Marcus's phone had become a constant stream of notifications. Text messages from former colleagues, LinkedIn connection requests from journalists, and emails from engineers he'd never met but who recognized their own stories in his legal battle against TechNova. Marcus sat in his apartment's small kitchen, coffee growing cold as he scrolled through responses that ranged from supportive to cautionary to openly hostile. The story had struck a nerve in Silicon Valley's technical community, exposing tensions that had been simmering beneath the industry's collaborative facade for years. Marcus Chen is either a hero or a cautionary tale, read one Twitter thread from a prominent venture capitalist. If engineers can retroactively claim ownership of innovations developed while employed, it could fundamentally destabilize how tech companies operate. Another thread, from a machine learning researcher at Stanford, took the opposite view. The Chen case highlights systematic exploitation of technical talent by corporate interests. How many breakthrough innovations are credited to companies rather than the individuals who created them? His phone rang. Elena Rodriguez, calling earlier than their usual morning check-ins. "Have you seen the responses?" she asked, without preamble. "I've been watching them come in all morning. It's intense." That's one word for it. I've received calls from 3 other patent attorneys this morning, all representing engineers who think they might have similar cases against their employers. This is becoming something bigger than we anticipated. Marcus moved to his living room window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline where dozens of tech companies were probably having emergency meetings about intellectual property policies. Is that good or bad for us? Both. Good because it validates our arguments and creates pressure for industry-wide change. Bad because TechNova now has even more incentive to destroy our case before it inspires a wave of similar lawsuits. Elena's prediction proved accurate within hours. By noon, TechNova had issued a public statement characterizing Marcus as a disgruntled former employee seeking to extort the company through baseless legal claims. They announced they were countersuing for defamation, breach of confidentiality, agreements, and intentional interference with business relationships. They're trying to make you the villain, Elena explained during an emergency afternoon meeting. Classic corporate playbook. When you can't win on the merits, attack the B. Person bringing the case. Marcus read through TechNova's countersuit, feeling the familiar sting of having his character and motivations misrepresented. But this time, instead of the shock and betrayal he'd felt 3 weeks earlier, he experienced something different. Clarity. Let them, he said, surprising Elena with his calm tone. Every accusation they make will have to be proven in court, which means they'll have to produce evidence about my actual contributions and behavior. That's discovery we can use. Elena smiled approvingly. You're learning to think like a lawyer. But are you prepared for the personal cost? They're going to try to destroy your reputation in the industry. Before Marcus could answer, Elena's assistant knocked on the conference room door. Ms. Rodriguez? There's someone here to see Mr. Chen. Says his name is David Kim and that he used to work with Mr. Chen at TechNova. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. David Kim had been his closest collaborator on the machine learning team, someone he'd considered a friend until the awkward encounters following his demotion. David entering their legal strategy meeting could mean anything from support to corporate espionage. Send him in, Marcus said, curiosity overcoming caution. David appeared in the doorway looking uncomfortable but determined, carrying a laptop, bag, and wearing the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who'd made an impulsive decision. He nodded to Elena before focusing on Marcus. I saw the article this morning, David said without preamble. I've been thinking about it all day, and I need to tell you something. TechNova asked me to provide a statement supporting their version of events. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. And I told them I couldn't do it, not honestly. David pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation. Marcus, what they're saying about your contributions, it's complete bullshit, and we both know. Elena leaned forward, her attention sharpening. Mr. Kim, I should advise you that anything you say here could potentially be used in litigation. You might want to consult with your own attorney before. I don't need an attorney to tell the truth, David interrupted. The algorithms they're taking public? Marcus developed the core innovations independently. I watched him do it, helped him test implementations, saw the progression from his initial breakthroughs to the final systems. David opened his laptop and pulled up a series of files. I've been keeping my own development logs, partly for patent applications of my own work and partly because, he paused, looking embarrassed. Partly because my father told me to document everything, the same way Marcus's father probably told him. Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena, who was taking rapid notes. What exactly do your logs show? Elena asked. They show the timeline of Marcus's innovations, including email chains where he explained concepts to me, technical presentations where he walked the team through breakthrough methodologies, and version control logs showing when key algorithms were first implemented. David turned his laptop toward them. They also show that when TechNova's legal team contacted me yesterday, they specifically asked me to focus on collaborative aspects and downplay Marcus's individual contributions. Elena's pen had stopped moving. They asked you to minimize his contributions? Direct quote from their lawyer, "We need you to emphasize that all innovations were collaborative efforts reflecting the company's investment in team-based development." David's expression hardened. That's when I realized they weren't asking for my honest assessment. They were asking me to help them steal credit for my friend's work. Marcus felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, vindication, and something deeper. David's presence meant he wasn't fighting this battle alone, that others recognized the principle at stake. "David, this could cost you your job," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe, but I've been thinking about what kind of industry I want to work in, what kind of person I want to be." David closed his laptop and looked directly at Marcus. 3 years ago, you could have claimed co-inventor status on patents I filed, for work we'd collaborated on. Instead, you insisted I get full credit because the core innovations were mine. You said that proper attribution matters, that it's how the industry builds trust and recognizes talent. David's voice grew stronger. "Now they're doing to you exactly what you refused to do to me. If I stay silent, I'm complicit in a system that steals credit from the people who actually create value." Elena had been listening intently, and now she leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone whose case had just gotten significantly stronger. "Mr. Kim, would you be willing to provide a sworn statement documenting Mr. Chen's contributions and TechNova's request that you minimize them?" "I'll do better than that," David said. "I'll testify. In court, under oath, in front of whoever needs to hear it." As they spent the next hour going through David's documentation, Marcus began to understand how profoundly the landscape had shifted. What had started as his individual fight for recognition was becoming a broader examination of how innovation was credited and compensated in the tech industry. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, which she read with growing amazement. "That was my contact at the SEC. 3 more companies have voluntarily amended their IPO filings this week to provide more detailed attribution for individual technical contributions. They're apparently concerned about regulatory scrutiny following our complaint." "The ripple effect is spreading," Marcus observed, "beyond what we imagined. But Marcus, you need to understand what this means for you personally. You're becoming the face of a movement, whether you intended to or not. That brings opportunities, but also risks." As if to illustrate her point, Marcus's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a familiar voice filled the room. Dr. Sarah Martinez, his former PhD advisor at Stanford. "Marcus, I've been following your case in the news. I wanted you to know that several of us in the academic community are preparing a statement supporting your position. The boundary between individual innovation and corporate ownership has been eroding for years, and your case might be the catalyst needed to restore proper balance." After the call ended, Marcus looked around Elena's conference room at the documents, legal filings, and evidence of growing support that had accumulated over the past month. His father's advice about the difference between revenge and justice was proving prophetic. He'd chosen justice, and justice was expanding beyond his individual situation to encompass broader questions of fairness and recognition. "What happens now?" he asked Elena. "Now we prepare for TechNova's escalated response. They're going to fight harder than ever because they recognize this case could set precedents that affect the entire industry." Elena gathered her notes with the efficient movements of someone entering a critical phase of battle. "But we're not the same people we were a month ago. We have documentation, witnesses, regulatory support, and public attention. Most importantly, we have the moral authority that comes from fighting for principles rather than just personal gain." As Marcus left the meeting that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since that devastating morning in TechNova's conference room. He'd discovered reservoirs of strength he hadn't known he possessed, allies he hadn't expected, and a cause larger than his individual grievances. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this began, Marcus Chen felt like he was winning. The mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 42nd floor of TechNova's headquarters buzzed with the kind of controlled tension that accompanies corporate crisis management. CEO Richard Blackstone sat at the head of the conference table, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the tight-lipped concentration of someone watching carefully constructed plans unravel in real time. Around the table sat TechNova's leadership team: Chief Technology Officer Amanda Walsh, General Counsel Patricia Morrison, Head of Communications Jake Sullivan, and 3 senior partners from Pemberton and Associates. The wall-mounted displays showed a cascade of metrics that told an increasingly troubling story: stock price volatility, delayed IPO timeline, and media coverage that grew more skeptical by the day. "Explain to me how one disgruntled engineer has managed to threaten a $9 billion IPO," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the steel that had made him a feared negotiator in Silicon Valley's acquisition wars. David Harrison from Pemberton and Associates consulted his tablet before responding. The Chen situation has evolved beyond a simple employment dispute. The SEC investigation has legitimized his claims in the minds of regulators and investors. More problematically, other tech companies are now preemptively modifying their own IP disclosures, creating an industry-wide shift that validates his position. Patricia Morrison, TechNova's general counsel, leaned forward. "Our internal analysis confirms that Chen's patents cover core algorithmic innovations that form the foundation of our machine learning capabilities. If he prevails in court, he could demand licensing fees that would significantly impact our profit margins." "Worse than that," Amanda Walsh interjected, her technical expertise cutting through the legal jargon. "Marcus's algorithms aren't just part of our system, they are our system's competitive advantage. Without them, we're offering commodity machine learning services in a crowded market." Jake Sullivan, the communications head, pulled up media monitoring reports on the wall display. "The narrative is shifting against us. Initial coverage focused on a patent dispute, but now we're seeing stories about corporate exploitation of immigrant talent and Silicon Valley's innovation appropriation problem." Chen is becoming a sympathetic figure. Blackstone studied the headlines scrolling across the screen. "The real creators behind tech innovation. Patent fight exposes industry's attribution problems. When corporations steal credit from individual genius." Each story featured Marcus's photograph alongside technical diagrams that illustrated his contributions to TechNova's success. "How did we get here?" Blackstone asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Chen was a talented engineer, but he was also an employee. His work belonged to the company. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. That's where the situation becomes legally complex. Chen filed his core patents independently before joining TechNova. He then licensed the technology to the company through a consulting agreement that retained his ownership rights. Our HR department apparently didn't flag this arrangement when he transitioned to full-time employment. "You're telling me we built our entire competitive strategy on technology we don't actually own?" "Not exactly," Patricia Morrison said carefully. "We have licensing rights to use Chen's patents, but the ownership structure is ambiguous. Chen's legal team is arguing that his demotion violated the consulting agreement and voided our licensing rights." Blackstone's expression darkened as the full implications became clear. "So he can shut down our use of the technology entirely?" "Theoretically, yes. An injunction based on patent infringement could halt our operations until we reach a settlement." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of climate control systems. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco's skyline stretched toward the Pacific, a vista that usually reinforced Blackstone's sense of corporate dominance. Today, it felt like a reminder of how quickly empires could crumble. "What are our options?" Blackstone asked. Harrison consulted his notes. "Legally, we continue fighting on multiple fronts. Challenge the patent validity, argue that his work was collaborative, claim breach of employment agreements. We've also filed counterclaims for defamation and business interference." "Practically," Morrison added, "we need to consider settlement. Chen's attorney has been consistent about her demands: full attribution, appropriate compensation, and systemic changes to how we recognize technical contributions." Systemic changes, Blackstone repeated with distaste. They want us to restructure our entire approach to intellectual property. It's more nuanced than that, Amanda Walsh said, pulling up internal documents on her laptop. I've been reviewing our IP policies, and frankly, they're outdated. Most leading tech companies have evolved their attribution practices over the past 5 years. We've been operating under assumptions that worked in the 90s, but don't reflect current best practices. Jake Sullivan nodded in agreement. From a communications perspective, adapting our policies could actually be positioned as innovation, leadership. TechNova leads industry in fair attribution practices. That's a better headline than TechNova fights engineer over patent rights. He pulled out his tablet, showing a timeline Elena had helped him prepare. Here's what actually happened. I developed breakthrough algorithms independently, licensed them to TechNova for equity and royalties, then watched as those licensing agreements were ignored when it became convenient to treat me as just another employee. The licensing agreements were superseded by your employment contract, Morrison argued. Were they? Elena asked pointedly. Because our review shows that the employment contract specifically excluded previously patented technologies from work-for-hire provisions. Someone at TechNova either didn't read the licensing terms carefully or chose to ignore them. The room fell silent as the legal implications became clear. Marcus watched Blackstone process the realization that his company's entire machine learning division had been built on technology they'd assumed they owned but actually only licensed, and those licenses might now be void. What would resolution look like from your perspective? Blackstone asked, his tone shifting from defensive to pragmatic. Elena opened another folder. Mr. Chen's position hasn't changed. First, appropriate attribution for his innovations in all company materials, including SEC filings and marketing communications. Second, compensation that reflects his actual contributions to company value. We're talking about hundreds of millions in revenue generated by his algorithms. Third, Marcus added, establishment of an innovation recognition program that ensures future technical contributors receive proper credit and protection. This problem is bigger than my individual situation. Harrison made notes as they spoke. Regarding compensation, what specifically are you seeking? Equity position commensurate with his role as effective co-founder of TechNova's AI capabilities, Elena replied, plus retroactive royalties on technology licensing and an ongoing technical leadership role. Blackstone's expression hardened. That's essentially demanding ownership of the company's most valuable division. No, Marcus said quietly. It's demanding recognition for work I actually did. Your AI division exists because of algorithms I developed independently. I'm not claiming credit for the business strategy, market positioning, or operational excellence that TechNova contributed. I'm claiming credit for the core technology that made it all possible. Morrison leaned forward. Even if we accepted that characterization, the company invested significantly in developing and commercializing your innovations. That value creation deserves recognition. Absolutely, Elena agreed, which is why we're not seeking full ownership, but appropriate shared credit. Mr. Chen's innovations enabled TechNova's success, but TechNova's execution realized that potential. Both contributions deserve recognition. The negotiation continued. For 2 hours, with each side probing the other's positions while carefully avoiding commitments. Marcus found himself studying Blackstone throughout the discussion, recognizing the executive's strategic intelligence while also noting his obvious discomfort with acknowledging individual technical contributions. During a break, Harrison pulled Blackstone aside for a whispered conversation that Marcus couldn't hear but could easily interpret. TechNova's legal team was advising settlement while their CEO struggled with the implications for corporate culture and control. When they reconvened, Blackstone's demeanor had shifted slightly. Marcus, help me understand your long-term goals. If we reach agreement on attribution and compensation, What's your vision for moving forward? The question revealed more vulnerability than Blackstone probably intended. Marcus realized the CEO was genuinely uncertain whether this was a business, negotiation, or an existential threat to his leadership. "I want to build things," Marcus said simply. "I want to work on problems that matter, with people who respect intellectual integrity, in an environment where innovation is properly valued. If TechNova can become that kind of company, I'd be proud to contribute to its success. And if it can't, then I'll build that company myself, using the patents and knowledge I've accumulated over 8 years. Either way, the work continues." Elena smiled slightly at Marcus's response, recognizing the elegant way he'd positioned his alternatives. TechNova could choose to be part of his future success, or watch him compete against them with technology they couldn't use without his permission. Blackstone absorbed this for a long moment before responding. "We'll need time to review your proposals with our board and technical teams. This conversation has been illuminating." As the meeting concluded with agreements to continue negotiations, the following week, Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. They demonstrated the strength of their position while keeping communication channels open, but real resolution would require TechNova to fundamentally reconsider how they valued individual technical contributions. Walking out of Pemberton and associates with Elena, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that devastating morning 6 weeks earlier. He'd discovered not just the strength to fight for his rights, but the strategic capability to fight effectively. "How do you think it went?" he asked Elena as they waited for the elevator. "Better than I expected. Blackstone is starting to understand that this isn't going away, and his legal team clearly recognizes the strength of our position." The elevator arrived and they stepped inside. "More importantly, you handled yourself like someone who belongs in that room. That's going to matter as we move toward final resolution." As they descended toward the street level, Marcus thought about his father's advice regarding the difference between revenge and justice. Today's meeting had felt like justice, difficult, complex, but ultimately focused on creating fair outcomes rather than inflicting damage. The battle wasn't over, but Marcus Chen was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for a principle that could reshape how innovation was valued and attributed across Silicon Valley. And for the first time since this began, he believed he was going to win. The second settlement meeting convened 3 weeks later, in a different venue, Elena Rodriguez's conference room in the Mission District. The change of location wasn't accidental. TechNova's willingness to come to Elena's office signaled a subtle but significant shift in the negotiation dynamics. They were no longer dictating terms from a position of assumed strength. Marcus arrived early, as had become his habit during this legal odyssey. The morning fog was just beginning to lift from the bay, and he used the quiet time to review the GRE intelligence Elena had gathered about TechNova's deteriorating position. The SEC investigation had expanded beyond their initial complaint, now examining the company's entire patent portfolio and attribution practices. 2 major institutional investors had withdrawn from the IPO pending resolution of the regulatory concerns. Most tellingly, 3 senior engineers had resigned in the past week, citing concerns about intellectual property recognition, departures that had been covered prominently in tech industry publications. "They're hemorrhaging credibility," Elena said as she joined Marcus in the conference room, carrying a thick folder of new documents. "But more importantly, they're starting to hemorrhage talent. Amanda Walsh called yesterday requesting an off-the-record conversation about their technical leadership pipeline." Marcus looked up from his tablet. "TechNova's CTO wants to talk to you directly?" "She's concerned that this case is becoming a catalyst for broader technical staff departures. Apparently, your situation has prompted some very uncomfortable conversations about compensation and recognition throughout their engineering organization." Elena spread out the latest developments across the conference table. Media coverage had evolved from reporting on a simple patent dispute to examining systemic questions about innovation attribution in Silicon Valley. Academic researchers were citing the case in papers about intellectual property reform. Most significantly, 3 other major tech companies had proactively revised their employee patent policies, explicitly citing the lessons learned from the TechNova situation. "We've become a case study," Marcus observed. "Exactly. Which gives us leverage but also responsibility. How we resolve this will influence how these issues are handled industry-wide." Before Marcus could respond, Elena's assistant announced the arrival of TechNova's delegation. This time, the group was smaller but more senior: Richard Blackstone, Amanda Walsh, and a single attorney from Pemberton and Associates. The reduced legal representation suggested they were here to negotiate rather than posture. As the TechNova team settled around Elena's conference table, Marcus studied their body language. Blackstone still carried himself with executive authority, but the casual confidence he'd displayed weeks earlier had been replaced by the focused tension of someone operating under significant pressure. Amanda Walsh looked genuinely interested in the technical aspects of the discussion, while their attorney seemed more observer than advocate. "Thank you for hosting us, Ms. Rodriguez," Blackstone began. "We've spent considerable time since our last meeting reviewing Mr. Chen's contributions and our internal processes. I think it's fair to say we've gained a better understanding of the situation's complexity." Elena nodded professionally. "We appreciate TechNova's willingness to engage in substantive discussions. Has your review changed your perspective on Mr. Chen's claims?" Amanda Walsh leaned forward. "From a technical standpoint, there's no question that Marcus's innovations form the foundation of our machine learning capabilities. Our internal analysis confirms that his algorithms represent the core competitive advantages in our AI division." The admission carried weight precisely because it came from TechNova's chief technology officer rather than their legal team. Marcus felt a surge of vindication, but also recognition that this acknowledgement represented a crucial step toward resolution. "More broadly," Blackstone continued, "we've recognized that our intellectual property attribution practices haven't kept pace with industry evolution. Several companies have reached out to us privately, describing similar challenges and their approaches to addressing them." Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena. The fact that other companies were proactively consulting with TechNova suggested the case's influence was spreading even faster than they'd realized. "We're prepared to make a comprehensive offer," Blackstone said, pulling out a document. "Full attribution for Marcus's innovations in all company materials, including a prominent acknowledgement in our IPO filings. Equity compensation reflecting his contributions to company value, specifically, a grant equivalent to co-founder status in our AI division. And establishment of an innovation recognition program with Marcus serving as technical advisor for its implementation." Elena reviewed the offer carefully while Marcus processed the magnitude of what TechNova was proposing. 6 weeks earlier, he'd been a demoted engineer contemplating quiet resignation. Now they were offering him recognition as a foundational contributor to one of Silicon Valley's most valuable IPOs. "The equity grant is significant," Elena said after completing her review. "But I notice it's structured as a one-time compensation rather than ongoing participation in the value creation Marcus's patents enable. We're also prepared to discuss licensing terms for his patents," Walsh added. "Ongoing royalties based on revenue generated by his algorithmic innovations, with provisions for renewal and expansion as the technology evolves." Marcus felt the conversation shift from adversarial negotiation to collaborative problem-solving. For the first time since this battle began, he sensed that TechNova genuinely understood the principle at stake, not just his individual compensation, but the broader question of how innovation should be valued and attributed. "There's one more element we need to address," Marcus said. "The innovation recognition program can't just be a policy document. It needs to include meaningful enforcement mechanisms and genuine commitment to cultural change." Blackstone nodded slowly. "What would that look like practically?" Marcus had been thinking about this question for weeks, drawing on conversations with his father about building institutions that would outlast individual personalities. Independent Review Board for Patent and Attribution Disputes. Standardized. Equity participation for significant technical contributions. Most importantly, transparency, making the recognition process visible to all technical staff. You're describing a fundamental restructuring of how we approach intellectual property, Walsh observed. Yes, because the current approach doesn't work. Not for the people creating the innovations, not for the companies that depend on them, and not for the industry's long-term health. Elena pulled out a tablet and began sketching the framework Marcus was describing. What Mr. Chen is proposing is actually quite similar to programs that leading tech companies have implemented over the past few years. The innovation isn't in the specific mechanisms, it's in the comprehensive commitment to fair attribution. The negotiation continued for 3 hours, with each side refining details and exploring implementation challenges. Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by Amanda Walsh's technical insights and even by Blackstone's strategic thinking, once it was focused on solving problems rather than avoiding responsibility. As they worked through the complexities of patent licensing, equity structures, and recognition programs, Marcus began to understand that they were creating something larger than a settlement agreement. They were developing a template that other companies could adopt, a framework for fairly balancing individual innovation with corporate value creation. I want to address something directly, Blackstone said during a brief break in the detailed negotiations. Marcus, this process has been challenging for me personally. I built TechNova on the belief that strong corporate leadership creates the conditions for innovation to flourish. Your case has forced me to recognize that individual brilliance deserves recognition even when it occurs within corporate structures. The admission was more personal than Marcus had expected from a CEO known for calculated public statements. Richard, I don't think corporate leadership and individual innovation are competing concepts. The best companies find ways to amplify both. That's what we're trying to build here. Agreed, but it requires acknowledging that our previous approach was incomplete. Blackstone paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. If we move forward with this agreement, I want your commitment that you'll help us get this right. Not just the legal framework, but the cultural implementation. Marcus considered the request, recognizing both its significance and its risks. Accepting would mean investing his reputation in TechNova's genuine transformation rather than simply extracting compensation and moving on. I'll commit to that if you commit to something in return, Marcus said. Real transparency about the process. Regular public reporting on the recognition program's implementation. Making TechNova a model that other companies can learn from, rather than just solving our specific dispute. Elena smiled at Marcus's response, recognizing the strategic wisdom of tying his personal success to broader industry transformation. If TechNova succeeded in implementing fair attribution practices, Marcus would be credited with catalyzing positive change. If they failed, the failure would be publicly visible and damaging to their reputation. That's acceptable, Blackstone said after a moment's consideration. Though I suspect you understand the pressure that puts on both of us to make this work. I'm counting on it. As the afternoon wore on, the settlement terms took final shape. Marcus would receive equity compensation worth approximately $12 million at current valuation, plus ongoing royalties on his patented technologies. More importantly, he would be appointed as Chief Innovation Officer, with responsibility for implementing the new recognition program and serving as an advocate for technical contributors throughout the organization. TechNova would publicly acknowledge his foundational contributions in their IPO materials and establish an Innovation Recognition Council with both employee and external representation. The program would include standardized processes for patent attribution, equity participation, for significant technical contributions, and transparent mechanisms for resolving disputes. There's one final element, Elena said as they reviewed the comprehensive agreement. What happens if this doesn't work? If TechNova reverts to previous practices or fails to implement the program meaningfully? Blackstone and Walsh exchanged glances before Blackstone responded. Then Marcus retains the right to terminate his licensing agreements and pursue alternative arrangements. Essentially, he could shut down our use of his patented technologies if we don't honor our commitments. The provision was elegant in its simplicity. TechNova's continued access to the innovations that powered their AI division would depend on their ongoing commitment to fair attribution practices. It created powerful incentives for genuine implementation rather than cosmetic compliance. As the meeting concluded with agreements to finalize documentation within the week, Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and anticipation. They'd achieved everything he'd hoped for when this battle began, but success brought new responsibilities and challenges. Walking out of Elena's office building into the late afternoon sunshine, Marcus called his father to share the news. James. Chen listened quietly as Marcus described the settlement terms, then responded with characteristic wisdom. You fought for justice and achieved it, James said. But now the real work begins. It's easier to demand change than to implement it successfully. You'll need to be as strategic about building this program as you were about winning the legal battle. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment reviewing the settlement documents and contemplating the path ahead. In 6 weeks, he'd transformed from a demoralized employee to a recognized innovator with the opportunity to reshape industry practices. But his father was right. Implementation would be more challenging than litigation. His phone buzzed with a text message from David Kim. Saw the news about the settlement. Proud of you for fighting this fight. Ready to help build something better. Similar messages had been arriving all day from colleagues, former classmates, and engineers he'd never met but who'd been following the case. The support was gratifying, but it also reinforced the weight of expectation. He wasn't just responsible for his own success now. He was responsible for proving that fair attribution could work in practice, not just in principle. Marcus Chen had won his battle against TechNova, but the war for innovation justice was just beginning. And this time, he would be fighting from the inside, armed with corporate authority and the mandate to create the change he'd demanded. The game had changed once again, and Marcus was ready to help write the rules for how it would be played in the future. 6 months after the settlement, Marcus Chen stood before a packed auditorium at Stanford University, delivering the keynote address at the annual conference on innovation and ethics in technology. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was speaking from the same stage where, as a graduate student 8 years earlier, he'd presented his first paper on machine learning, optimization to an audience of perhaps 30 people. Today, the auditorium was filled with engineers, entrepreneurs, academics, and journalists, all gathered to hear about what had become known as the TechNova model for innovation attribution. The settlement that had begun as Marcus's personal fight for recognition had evolved into a comprehensive framework that was being studied and adopted across Silicon Valley. When I first filed those patents in my apartment 8 years ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. My father told me that preparation without purpose was just anxiety, but preparation with purpose was power. I thought I was just protecting my work. I didn't realize I was preparing to challenge an entire industry's assumptions about who creates value and how that creation should be recognized. In the front row, James Chen sat beside Elena Rodriguez, both wearing expressions of quiet pride. Behind them, Marcus could see Amanda Walsh from TechNova, David Kim and several other former colleagues, and dozens of engineers he'd met over the past months as other companies had reached out to understand the innovation recognition program they'd built. The TechNova case wasn't really about patents or compensation, Marcus continued. It was about dignity. About the basic principle that people who create breakthrough innovations deserve credit for their work, regardless of their immigration status, their position in corporate hierarchies, or their willingness to demand recognition. Marcus clicked to his first slide, showing a timeline of innovation attribution practices across major tech companies. 6 months ago, fewer than 20% of Silicon Valley companies had formal programs for recognizing individual technical contributions. Today, that number has risen to over 60%, with more companies announcing programs each month. The statistics were impressive, but Marcus knew that numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of success would be whether these programs created meaningful change in how innovation was valued and attributed, or whether they became cosmetic responses to public pressure. At TechNova, we've learned that building effective innovation recognition requires more than policy documents, Marcus said, clicking to a slide showing the company's organizational structure. It requires cultural transformation, starting with leadership's genuine commitment to shared success. The slide showed TechNova's Innovation Recognition Council, which included representatives from engineering, legal, HR, and external advisors. More significantly, it showed how the company had restructured its patent application process to ensure individual inventors received proper attribution and equity participation. The council isn't just a review board, it's an advocacy body for technical contributors, Marcus explained. When engineers develop significant innovations, the council ensures they receive appropriate recognition, compensation, and career advancement opportunities. More importantly, it creates transparency around these decisions. Marcus had spent considerable time developing the council's procedures, drawing on his father's wisdom about building institutions that would outlast individual personalities. The framework included standardized criteria for evaluating technical contributions, clear processes for resolving attribution disputes, and public reporting requirements that made the program's effectiveness visible to all employees. Transparency was crucial, Marcus continued. Secret recognition programs don't build trust. They just create different forms of favoritism. Every patent application, equity grant, and attribution decision goes through documented processes that employees can understand and challenge if necessary. The audience was taking notes actively, and Marcus could see several people recording his presentation on their phones. The attention was flattering, but also weighty. He understood that his words would influence how other companies approached these issues. But systematic change requires more than internal programs, Marcus said, clicking to a slide showing cross-industry collaboration. That's why TechNova has joined with 12 other companies to establish the Innovation Attribution Consortium, a shared platform for developing best practices and supporting legislative reform. The consortium had been Amanda Walsh's idea, building on conversations that had emerged from the publicity around Marcus's case. Companies that had initially viewed the TechNova settlement as a threat were now recognizing that collaborative approaches to innovation attribution could benefit everyone by attracting and retaining top technical talent. The consortium isn't about creating uniform policies, Marcus explained. Different companies have different cultures and business models, but we're developing shared principles: transparency in attribution decisions, meaningful participation in value creation, and support for legislative reforms that protect individual innovators. Marcus clicked to his next slide, showing proposed changes to patent law that would strengthen individual inventors' rights while preserving companies' ability to commercialize innovations. Current patent law was written for an era when most innovations came from individual inventors working independently. Today's reality is more complex. Breakthrough technologies emerge from collaboration between brilliant individuals and sophisticated corporate infrastructure. The legislative reform efforts had gained momentum following Marcus's case, with several congressional representatives introducing bills to clarify patent ownership rules and strengthen attribution requirements. While the legislation faced significant corporate opposition, the growing number of companies adopting voluntary recognition programs was creating pressure for industry-wide standards. Legal reform is important, Marcus said, but cultural change is more powerful. When companies genuinely value individual innovation, they don't need to be forced to provide fair attribution. They do it because it helps them attract and retain the best. As Marcus moved into the question and answer portion of his presentation, the first question came from a young engineer who identified herself as a recent immigrant from India. Mr. Chen, your case has inspired many of us who sometimes feel invisible in corporate environments. But implementing change requires support from leadership. How do you convince executives to embrace transparency and shared recognition when it might reduce their own authority? The question struck at the heart of the challenge Marcus had been grappling with for months. It requires demonstrating that shared recognition actually enhances leadership rather than diminishing it, he replied. Great leaders understand that their success depends on the success of the people they lead. When executives get credit for building environments where innovation flourishes, they benefit from individual contributors' achievements rather than competing with them. He paused, thinking about his evolving relationship with Richard Blackstone. 6 months ago, TechNova's CEO saw individual recognition as a threat to corporate authority. Today, he regularly speaks about how the innovation program has strengthened his leadership by attracting better talent and creating more breakthrough innovations. The company's success has become his success, but in a way that includes rather than excludes the people doing the actual creating. A second question came from a venture capitalist in the middle of the auditorium. Mr. Chen, while individual recognition sounds admirable, doesn't it create complications for companies seeking investment? Investors want to know their backing. Corporate assets, not individual dependencies. Marcus had anticipated this concern, having discussed it extensively with TechNova's board during the program's development. Actually, transparent innovation attribution reduces investment risk rather than increasing it, he replied. When companies can demonstrate that they have systematic approaches to recognizing and retaining key technical talent, investors gain confidence in the sustainability of their competitive advantages. He clicked to a slide showing TechNova's valuation progression since implementing the recognition program. Our IPO pricing exceeded initial projections by 18%, partly because investors recognized that our innovation attribution program would help us maintain our technical leadership over time. Transparency about individual contributions actually makes corporate assets more valuable, not less. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from specific implementation challenges to broader philosophical questions about balancing individual recognition with corporate objectives. Marcus found himself drawing repeatedly on lessons his father had taught him about building sustainable institutions, the importance of clear processes, consistent application, and genuine commitment from leadership. As the formal presentation concluded, Marcus was approached by dozens of audience members seeking more detailed information about implementation strategies, legal frameworks, and organizational change management. The conversations stretched on for over an hour, with engineers sharing their own experiences of innovation attribution challenges and executives seeking advice on adapting the TechNova model to their own companies. One conversation particularly struck Marcus, with Dr. Jennifer Liu, a robotics researcher at a major automotive company who had been struggling with patent attribution issues remarkably similar to his own original situation. Your case gave me the courage to document my contributions and seek proper recognition, Dr. Liu told him. But more importantly, it showed me that individual engineers don't have to accept unfair treatment as inevitable. We can change these systems if we're strategic about it. Marcus exchanged contact information with Dr. Liu and several other engineers, understanding that his role was evolving from individual advocate to movement catalyst. The network of engineers, lawyers, and executives working on innovation attribution, reform was growing rapidly, creating momentum for changes that extended far beyond any single company or case. As the evening reception began, Marcus found himself in conversation with Elena Rodriguez and Amanda Walsh, reflecting on how their relationships had evolved from adversarial to collaborative. 6 months ago, I never imagined we'd be working together on industry reform, Walsh said, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. But this has been one of the most rewarding projects of my career. Building systems that actually support innovation feels much better than defending systems that suppress it. Elena smiled. From a legal perspective, this case has been fascinating because it's shown how individual advocacy can create systemic change when it's backed by solid preparation and strategic thinking. Marcus's patents gave him leverage, but his vision gave the leverage purpose. Marcus thought about the path that had brought them to this point, from that devastating meeting in TechNova's conference room to tonight's celebration of industry-wide change. My father always said that the best battles are fought not just for personal vindication, but to create better conditions for the people who come after. I think we're succeeding at that. As the reception wound down, Marcus received a text message from David Kim, who was now leading TechNova's implementation of the Innovation Recognition Program. Watched your presentation online. Brilliant as always. Also, the patent application we filed today lists you as primary inventor on the new optimization algorithm. Feels good to get attribution right from the beginning. Marcus smiled, understanding that David's message represented the ultimate validation of their efforts. The Innovation Recognition Program was working not just as policy, but as lived practice that was becoming embedded in TechNova's culture. The next morning, Marcus returned to TechNova's headquarters for his regular Innovation Council meeting. Walking through the same lobby where his keycard had been rejected 7 months earlier, he reflected on how completely the landscape had changed. His nameplate now read Marcus Chen, Chief Innovation Officer, and his office overlooked the same courtyard where he'd once felt like an exile. But the most significant change wasn't in his title or office location. It was in the dozens of emails he received each week from engineers throughout the company, seeking guidance on patent applications, attribution questions, and career development. The recognition program had created a culture where technical contributors felt empowered to advocate for themselves and their innovations. The Innovation Council meeting included representatives from engineering, legal, HR, and business development, plus 2 external advisors from academia and other tech companies. Today's agenda focused on reviewing the quarter's patent applications and equity grants, evaluating the program's effectiveness, and planning expansion to TechNova's international offices. We've processed 43 patent applications this quarter, reported Sarah Kim, the council's administrative coordinator. 38 have been approved for filing with individual inventors properly attributed. The 5 rejections were for innovations that didn't meet our originality criteria, but those inventors have been connected with mentorship resources to help develop their ideas further. Marcus reviewed the statistics with satisfaction. The numbers represented not just administrative efficiency, but cultural transformation. Engineers were actively pursuing recognition for their innovations rather than accepting anonymous contribution as inevitable. More significantly, added Jennifer Martinez from HR, we've seen a 28% increase in internal patent applications compared to the same quarter last year. Engineers are more actively documenting and pursuing recognition for their innovations. Amanda Walsh pulled up performance metrics on the conference room display. The business impact has been equally positive. Revenue from licensed technologies has increased 43%, partly because we're now properly identifying and protecting our most valuable innovations. The meeting continued with detailed reviews of specific cases, including a breakthrough in data compression algorithms developed by a team in TechNova's Austin office, and a machine learning optimization technique created by a junior engineer who had been with the company for only 8 months. The Austin team case is particularly interesting, Walsh explained, because it demonstrates how the recognition program handles collaborative innovations. 3 engineers made significant contributions, but at different stages of development. Our framework allows us to attribute credit proportionally while ensuring everyone receives appropriate recognition. Marcus studied the attribution analysis, recognizing the sophisticated thinking that had gone into balancing individual contributions with collaborative development. This is exactly the kind of nuanced evaluation that was impossible under our old system, he observed. We're not just documenting innovation, we're understanding it more deeply. As the meeting concluded, Marcus remained in the conference room to review the quarterly report he would be presenting to TechNova's board the following week. The document represented more than operational updates. It was a comprehensive analysis of how innovation attribution was transforming the company's culture, performance, and competitive position. The report's conclusions were striking. TechNova was attracting higher-quality engineering talent, retaining key contributors more effectively, and generating more breakthrough innovations. Would you be willing to serve as a consultant on building strong legal positions? The request represented an evolution Marcus had been anticipating, from individual advocate to movement mentor. Absolutely. But I want to make sure we're not just helping individuals fight battles. We should be working toward systematic change that makes these battles unnecessary. Agreed. That's why I'm proposing we establish a formal advisory service, legal representation combined with strategic consulting on innovation attribution. We could create a model that other attorneys could replicate in different markets. As Marcus considered Elena's proposal, he realized how far his thinking had evolved from the narrow focus on personal recognition that had motivated his original lawsuit. The case had become a catalyst for industry-wide transformation, and his role was expanding from beneficiary to architect of systemic change. That evening, Marcus had dinner with his parents at Golden Dragon Restaurant, a weekly tradition that had become even more meaningful since his legal victory. Chen listened intently as Marcus described the day's developments, occasionally asking questions that revealed his deep understanding of both business strategy and institutional change. "You've achieved something remarkable," James said, as they shared tea after dinner. "But success creates new responsibilities. People will look to you for leadership on issues far beyond your individual expertise." Marcus nodded, understanding his father's gentle warning. "How do I make sure I don't overextend or lose focus on what really matters?" "Remember why you started this fight," James replied. "It wasn't about becoming famous or powerful, it was about dignity and fairness. As long as your decisions serve those principles, you'll make good choices." His mother, who had been quietly following the conversation, reached across the table to take Marcus's hand. "Your father and I are proud of what you've accomplished," she said in Mandarin. "But we're more proud of who you've become through this process. You've learned to use success as a tool for helping others, not just yourself." As Marcus walked home through the Mission District that night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a demoralized employee to a recognized leader in innovation reform. The path had been longer and more complex than he'd ever imagined, requiring legal strategy, business acumen, political awareness, and personal growth in equal measure. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard Blackstone. "Reviewed your quarterly report. Impressive results. More importantly, impressive vision for where we go next. Looking forward to our board presentation." The message represented something Marcus could never have imagined 7 months earlier. Genuine partnership with the executive who had once seen him as a disposable employee. Their relationship had evolved through conflict into collaboration, demonstrating that even adversarial situations could create opportunities for mutual benefit when approached with strategic wisdom and principled goals. Marcus Chen had set out to win recognition for his individual contributions. Instead, he had catalyzed a movement that was reshaping how innovation was valued and attributed across Silicon Valley. The game had changed permanently, and he had helped write the new rules. But as his father had reminded him, success created new responsibilities. The recognition program at TechNova was just the beginning, a proof of concept for transformation that needed to spread throughout the industry. Marcus's next challenge would be ensuring that the changes he'd fought for would outlast his individual involvement and create lasting improvements for the engineers who would follow in his footsteps. The battle for innovation justice was far from over, but Marcus Chen was no longer fighting alone. He had built a movement, and the movement was building a better future. 2 years after the settlement, Marcus Chen found himself in an unexpected role, testifying before the House Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Internet. The mahogany-paneled hearing room in the Rayburn Building buzzed with the controlled energy of congressional proceedings, cameras capturing every word for the public record, and the tech industry executives who were watching intently from their corporate headquarters. "Mr. Chen," said Congresswoman Maria Santos, the subcommittee chair, "your case has been cited as a catalyst for significant changes in how technology companies handle innovation attribution. Can you explain to the committee why legislative action is necessary when companies appear to be adopting voluntary reforms?" Marcus adjusted his microphone, drawing on months of preparation with Elena Rodriguez and policy experts from the Innovation Attribution Consortium. The hearing represented the culmination of lobbying efforts that had grown organically from his individual case into a coordinated campaign for systemic reform. Thank you, Congresswoman Santos. While voluntary reforms have created meaningful progress, they remain inconsistent and vulnerable to changes in corporate leadership or market pressures. Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system. The current patchwork of company-specific policies creates confusion for inventors and fails to provide the legal certainty necessary for innovation to flourish. He clicked a remote control, activating slides that appeared on monitors throughout the hearing room. This chart shows innovation attribution practices across 50 major technology companies. While 37 have adopted some form of recognition program since 2023, the variations in implementation create significant disparities in how inventors are treated. The slides illustrated Marcus's key point. Voluntary reforms had created a complex landscape where an engineer's rights and recognition depended entirely on which company employed them, rather than on consistent legal standards. Some companies had embraced comprehensive attribution programs similar to TechNova's model, while others had implemented minimal policies designed more for public relations than substantive change. Representative Johnson, Marcus continued, addressing a committee member from Texas, has asked specifically about the economic impact of attribution reform. Our analysis shows that companies with robust innovation recognition programs have seen average increases of 23% in patent applications, 18% in employee retention among senior technical staff, and 15% in revenue from intellectual property licensing. The statistics represented careful analysis by the Innovation Attribution Consortium, which had grown into an influential policy organization with backing from progressive tech companies, engineering, professional associations, and academic institutions. Marcus served on its board alongside other prominent figures in the reform movement, including Dr. Jennifer Liu, whose own successful attribution case had followed the template established by Marcus's victory. Congressman Robert Hayes from California, who had been largely silent during the morning's proceedings, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Chen, critics argue that your proposed legislation would create excessive regulatory burden on American companies, potentially driving innovation offshore to countries with less restrictive intellectual property regimes. How do you respond to those concerns?" Marcus had anticipated this question, knowing that Hayes had received significant campaign contributions from tech companies opposing the reform legislation. "Congressman Hayes, that argument fundamentally misunderstands what drives innovation," he replied calmly. "Talented engineers don't choose employers based on weak intellectual property protections. They choose employers who offer meaningful recognition, fair compensation, and opportunities for career advancement." He clicked to his next slide, showing international innovation metrics. Countries with stronger individual inventor protections, like Germany and Sweden, have actually seen increased technology sector growth and higher rates of breakthrough innovation. The proposed legislation would enhance America's competitive advantage by ensuring we attract and retain the world's most talented technical contributors. The exchange illustrated the political complexity surrounding innovation attribution reform. While the movement had gained significant grassroots support among engineers and progressive politicians, it faced organized opposition from corporate interests that preferred the flexibility of voluntary, company-specific policies over standardized legal requirements. Moreover, Marcus continued, the current system creates significant risks for American companies operating internationally. When intellectual property ownership is ambiguous or disputed, it complicates everything from licensing agreements to merger and acquisition transactions. Clear attribution standards reduce legal uncertainty and facilitate business operations. Elena Rodriguez, watching from the gallery, recognized Marcus's strategic pivot toward business arguments that conservative committee members would find compelling. His testimony had been carefully crafted to appeal across party lines by emphasizing economic benefits rather than abstract principles of fairness. Congresswoman Sarah Kim from Washington, herself a former software engineer, asked the most technical question of the hearing. Mr. Chen, modern technology development often involves hundreds of contributors working on interconnected systems. How would standardized attribution requirements handle the complexity of collaborative innovation without creating administrative burden that slows development? Excellent question, Congresswoman Kim. Blackstone studied his team, recognizing the subtle shift in their recommendations. A month ago, they would have unanimously supported aggressive litigation. Now, facing regulatory investigation, public scrutiny, and the possibility of losing access to their core technology, they were advising accommodation. What would settlement actually look like? He asked. Harrison pulled out a document Elena Rodriguez had submitted the previous week. Chen's terms haven't changed. Reinstatement to an appropriate technical leadership position, equity compensation reflecting his contributions, public acknowledgement of his innovations, and establishment of an IP attribution program for future technical staff. He wants his job back? Morrison asked with surprise. More than that. He wants a position commensurate with his actual contributions to the company's value, essentially, recognition as a co-founder of our machine learning capabilities. Blackstone felt his temper flare. Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with employees who sue the company. Richard, Amanda Walsh said quietly, Marcus Chen isn't just any employee. His algorithms generated over $200 million in revenue last year alone. If we're honest about it, he has a legitimate claim to co-founder status for our AI division. The admission hung in the air like an unwelcome truth. Blackstone had built TechNova's culture around the belief that corporate leadership created value while individual contributors simply executed vision. Acknowledging Chen's foundational role would challenge that entire framework. There's another consideration, Harrison added reluctantly. Chen's case is inspiring similar challenges at other companies. If we settle favorably, it might encourage more litigation. If we fight and lose, the precedent could be even worse. And if we fight and win, then we validate the current system but face ongoing regulatory scrutiny, negative publicity, and the risk that Chen develops competing technology using patents we can't challenge. Blackstone stood and walked to the windows, looking out, at the city where dozens of his competitors were probably having similar conversations about intellectual property, attribution, and the changing expectations of technical talent. Schedule a meeting with Chen and his attorney, he said finally. But make it clear we're exploring settlement, not capitulating. I want to understand exactly what he thinks he's accomplished with this circus. Richard, Morrison said carefully, approaching settlement from a position of hostility won't be effective. Chen's attorney is sophisticated, and they hold stronger cards than we initially realized. Then what do you recommend? Acknowledge that we made mistakes in how we handled his contributions. Focus on finding mutually beneficial solutions, rather than defending past decisions. Most importantly, recognize that this case is about principle as much as money. Chen seems genuinely motivated by the desire for fair treatment. Jake Sullivan pulled up social media monitoring data. The public narrative supports that assessment. Chen isn't attacking the company personally or seeking maximum financial damage. His statements consistently focus on fair attribution and systemic change. As the meeting concluded with assignments for settlement preparation, Blackstone remained at the window, contemplating how dramatically the landscape had shifted. A month ago, Marcus Chen had been a demoted employee they assumed would accept his diminished status quietly. Now he was forcing them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about innovation, ownership, and recognition. The irony wasn't lost on Blackstone that Chen's legal strategy mirrored his own algorithmic innovations, elegant, systematic, and devastatingly effective. Perhaps, he thought grudgingly, that shouldn't have been surprising. Marcus Chen had spent 8 years proving his strategic thinking in technical domains. Now he was demonstrating that those same capabilities applied to corporate warfare, legal maneuvering, and public relations. For the first time since this battle began, Richard Blackstone was beginning to understand that he might have underestimated his opponent in ways that could prove very expensive indeed. The game was changing, and Marcus Chen was writing the new rules. The neutral conference room at Pemberton & Associates felt like a diplomatic summit, carefully designed to avoid giving either side psychological advantage. Marcus sat beside Elena Rodriguez at one end of the polished oak table, while TechNova's delegation occupied the opposite end, CEO Richard Blackstone, General Counsel Patricia Morrison, and lead attorney David Harrison. The physical distance between the parties seemed to mirror the gulf between their positions. Marcus had prepared for this moment through weeks of strategy sessions with Elena, but seeing Blackstone in person brought back memories of company presentations where he'd explained his innovations to executives who'd smiled and nodded while privately calculating how to monetize his work. Today, however, the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "Thank you all for coming," Harrison began with practiced neutrality. "We're here to explore whether there's a mutually beneficial resolution to the current litigation. Mr. Blackstone, would you like to begin?" Blackstone studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking. "Marcus, I want to start by acknowledging that we clearly mishandled your transition within the company. Your contributions to TechNova's success have been significant, and our failure to recognize that appropriately led to this unfortunate situation." The words carried the careful phrasing of corporate crisis management, but Marcus detected something unexpected beneath the surface, genuine surprise, as if Blackstone was still processing how a routine employee demotion had escalated into an existential threat to the company's IPO. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," Marcus replied evenly. "But this isn't just about my situation. The way TechNova has handled intellectual property attribution reflects systemic problems that affect every technical contributor in your organization." Elena placed a folder on the table. "Since our last communication, we've been contacted by 17 current and former TechNova engineers who believe they have similar claims regarding unattributed innovations. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern." Patricia Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Rodriguez, those allegations are unsubstantiated and—" "Are they?" Elena interrupted, pulling out a document. "Because our research shows that TechNova has filed 43 patents over the past 5 years listing corporate entities as inventors rather than the individual engineers who actually developed the technologies. That's unusual even by Silicon Valley standards." Blackstone's jaw tightened. "Patents filed by employees using company resources belong to the company. That's standard practice across the industry." "Standard perhaps, but not necessarily. Legal when the innovations were developed independently and then licensed to the company," Elena replied. "Which brings us to the core issue. Mr. Chen's patents predate his employment and were never properly assigned to TechNova. Harrison consulted his notes. Mr. Chen, our understanding is that you were compensated fairly for your contributions during your 8 years with the company. What exactly are you seeking that previous compensation didn't address? Marcus had anticipated this question, but answering it required balancing legal strategy with personal truth. 8 years ago, I was a recent graduate grateful for the opportunity to work on interesting problems. I trusted that my contributions would be recognized appropriately as my career progressed. Instead, I watched my innovations become company assets while my role was systematically diminished. Marcus asked, grateful for a moment to collect his thoughts. Better than expected, Elena replied. Hayes and his allies are clearly opposed, but several committee members seem genuinely interested in finding solutions. Congresswoman Kim's question suggests she understands the technical issues. Amanda Walsh, who had testified earlier about TechNova's positive experience with innovation attribution, pulled out her phone to check social media reactions. The coverage is mostly positive. Innovation justice is trending, and several prominent engineers are sharing their own attribution stories. The social media movement had grown organically around Marcus's case, with engineers, researchers, and technical professionals sharing experiences of unrecognized contributions and demanding systemic change. The hashtag campaigns, online petitions, and viral testimonials had created political pressure that complemented the formal lobbying efforts of the Innovation Attribution Consortium. When the hearing resumed, Marcus faced questions from Congressman Syed David Thompson from Ohio, who had emerged as one of the legislation's strongest supporters. Mr. Chen, you've described the business case for attribution reform, but I'd like you to address the human impact. What does proper recognition mean for individual inventors and their families? The question allowed Marcus to shift from policy analysis to personal narrative, drawing on stories he'd collected from hundreds of engineers who had contacted him over the past 2 years. Congressman Thompson, proper attribution affects every aspect of an inventor's career trajectory, Marcus began, his voice carrying new emotional weight. When engineers receive credit for their innovations, they advance faster in their careers, earn higher compensation, and gain opportunities to work on more challenging problems. When their contributions go unrecognized, they often plateau professionally or leave the industry entirely. He clicked to a slide showing demographic data that had become central to the reform movement's arguments. This particularly affects women, minorities, and immigrants, who are already underrepresented in technical leadership roles. Attribution disputes disproportionately impact these groups, creating additional barriers to career advancement in technology fields. The demographic argument had proven powerful in building political coalitions, linking innovation attribution to broader concerns about diversity, equity, and immigration policy. Progressive politicians who might not have been interested in patent law technicalities were motivated by evidence that current attribution practices perpetuated systemic inequalities. I've heard from dozens of female engineers whose breakthrough innovations were credited to male colleagues or supervisors, Marcus continued. From immigrant researchers whose work was claimed by companies while their visa status made them vulnerable to retaliation. From young inventors whose ideas were appropriated by senior executives who contributed nothing to the actual development. Marcus paused, thinking about Dr. Jennifer Liu, whose robotics innovations had been credited to her department head until she'd used strategies learned from Marcus's case to successfully challenge the attribution. Her victory had inspired dozens of similar cases, creating a wave of individual challenges that had accelerated corporate policy changes. But when attribution is handled fairly, these inventors thrive, Marcus said. They file more patents, develop more breakthrough technologies, and often become mentors who help the next generation of innovators. Proper recognition creates positive cycles that benefit entire industries. The hearing's final hour focused on implementation details, with committee members asking specific questions about enforcement mechanisms, dispute resolution procedures, and international coordination. Marcus found himself drawing extensively on his experience implementing TechNova's innovation recognition program, providing concrete examples of how theoretical policy frameworks translated into practical business operations. The key insight from our implementation experience, Marcus explained in response to a question about enforcement, is that transparency prevents most disputes from escalating to formal proceedings. When attribution decisions are made through documented processes, with clear criteria, inventors rarely challenge the outcomes. He showed statistics from TechNova's 2 years of operating under the new attribution framework. Over 200 innovation cases had been processed, with fewer than 5 resulting in formal disputes. The vast majority of attribution decisions had been accepted by all parties, suggesting that fair processes produced trusted outcomes. As the hearing concluded, Congresswoman Santos thanked the witnesses and announced that the subcommittee would be drafting legislation based on the testimony and evidence presented. While the political process would likely take months or years to complete, the hearing had clearly established innovation attribution as a legitimate policy priority with bipartisan support. Walking out of the Rayburn building with Elena and Amanda, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and apprehension that had characterized each milestone in his journey from individual litigant to movement leader. The congressional hearing represented validation of arguments he'd been making for 2 years, but it also highlighted how complex and contentious the path to legislative reform would be. "What happens next?" Amanda asked as they waited for a taxi to Reagan National Airport. "Now we build more evidence," Elena replied, pulling out a thick folder of materials they'd prepared for follow-up meetings with congressional staff. "We need more companies implementing attribution programs, more success stories, and more data showing positive business impacts. Legislative change happens slowly, but business adoption can accelerate it." Marcus nodded, understanding that the hearing was just one battle in a longer campaign. "We also need to make sure the reforms we're advocating actually work in practice. If we get legislation passed but companies can't implement it effectively, we'll have failed." The conversation continued during their flight back to San Francisco, with the 3 of them planning the next phase of advocacy efforts. The Innovation Attribution Consortium was organizing regional conferences to help companies implement recognition programs. Elena was expanding her legal practice to handle attribution cases nationwide. Amanda was leading TechNova's efforts to share their implementation experience with other companies. Marcus's role was evolving again, from individual advocate to policy expert to movement strategist. Universities had begun inviting him to teach courses on innovation policy. International technology organizations were asking him to consult on attribution frameworks for different legal systems. Publishers were requesting books about his experience and the broader implications for innovation incentives. But perhaps most meaningfully, engineers throughout the industry were reaching out to share their own stories of successful attribution advocacy, often crediting Marcus's case with providing the template and inspiration for their efforts. The movement had grown beyond any individual leader or organization, becoming a self-sustaining force for systemic change. That evening, back in San Francisco, Marcus had dinner with his parents at Golden Dragon Restaurant. James Chen listened thoughtfully as Marcus described the congressional hearing, occasionally asking questions that revealed his deep understanding of political strategy and institutional change. "You've created something larger than yourself," James observed as they shared tea after dinner. "That's the mark of meaningful leadership, when the movement continues to grow, even if you step away from it." Marcus considered his father's words, recognizing both their accuracy and their challenge. The innovation attribution movement had indeed developed its own momentum, with dozens of organizations, hundreds of advocates, and thousands of individual inventors working toward systemic reform. His role was increasingly about coordination, and strategy rather than individual advocacy. But with growth comes the risk of losing focus, Marcus replied. How do we ensure the movement maintains its core principles as it becomes more institutionalized? The same way we built this restaurant. After losing the first one, James said with a slight smile. Clear values, consistent practices, and careful attention to the people you're serving. Movements succeed when they remain connected to the individual stories that inspired them. As Marcus walked home through the Mission District that night, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that devastating morning in TechNova's conference room 3 years earlier. He'd transformed from a demoralized employee to a nationally recognized advocate for innovation reform, but the core motivation remained the same: ensuring that people who create breakthrough technologies receive the recognition and compensation they deserve. His phone buzzed with a text message from David Kim. Watched your congressional testimony online. Brilliant as always. Also, got approval today for the innovation mentorship program you proposed, launching next month with 15 engineers participating. The message reminded Marcus that the most important changes were still happening at the individual level. Engineers gaining confidence to advocate for themselves, companies developing fairer attribution practices, and young inventors learning that they didn't have to accept unrecognized contributions as inevitable. Marcus Chen had set out to win recognition for his individual innovations. Instead, he had catalyzed a movement that was reshaping how society valued and rewarded technical creativity. The congressional hearing represented just one milestone in a longer journey toward systemic reform that would benefit countless engineers who would never know his name but would benefit from the changes he'd helped create. The battle for innovation justice was far from over, but it was no longer a battle Marcus was fighting alone. He had built a movement, and the movement was building a better future for everyone who dared to imagine solutions to impossible problems. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.